there's only a couple adjustments on the tenoning jig. Over on the side here is a clamp that will allow you to clamp your piece firmly in the jig. Okay. If you're working with, I have it back this way a little because we're working with a narrow piece. If you had a wider piece, you may want to loosen this one screw, shove it up so that you always have your clamp somewhere about in the middle of your workpiece. On the other side of the jig, we have, by the way, we have two handles here. Those are for your hands, okay? And that's where your hands should be, because remember, you're working without guards, and you're working without the splitter, of course, but that's no problem because your workpiece is clamped in. We have a couple of adjustments. Three, actually. This adjustment right here allows the tenoning jig to adjust pretty close to, it'll slide back and forth to get pretty close to the thickness of the piece that you're cutting the tenon on. Once you get to the spot where you want to be, then you just snug it up with this little handle. This knob right here, if you can see right here, this is the micro adjustment so that you can micro adjust both ways toward the blade or away from the blade to cut exactly how much you want to cut or shave off of your tenon. These two nuts right here are not for adjusting. Don't touch those two nuts. All those nuts do is hold this little brass bushing in place so that the micro adjustment will work both ways. You start loosening those nuts, you're going to end up screwing the whole thing up because that's the way it was when we first started working on it here, and we figured out that those nuts have to be fixed at all times. Okay? You have the one nut and then you have another locking nut behind it so that it just doesn't move to a different position. Once you're in a position where you want to be, you tighten down this lever and that locks the whole thing up. Okay? And then you're ready to push your tenoning jig through the saw. This adjustment right here is if you want to put a bevel. I don't know that I ever saw anyone do that. Put a bevel on the bottom of your on your tenon as you go through the saw. When you're working with tenons and mortises, this is important. You always want to cut your mortise first. Never try to cut your tenon first and then go over to the mortise machine and try to match your mortise up to the tenon. The reason for that is because these mortise chisels are fixed. You cannot change the width. If you're working with a 3/16 mortise chisel, it's going to be 3/16. If you're working with a 1/2 inch, it's going to be a 1/2 inch. Now, this direction, you can make it as long as you want. But this direction, you have to go with the size of the mortise chisel. That's why you want to always cut your mortise first, and then you cut your tenon to fit inside your mortise like that. You just keep shaving your tenon or massaging your tenon until it fits nice and snug. And if your tenon doesn't fit real snug width-wise, I wouldn't worry about it too much because, see, this has a little play in there. You want a little room for your glue anyhow. So you want it just to fit just about like that, and you just keep shaving until you get that kind of a fit. Now, let's say that you have multiple pieces to cut the tenon on. You always want to have your pieces right here so that once you start cutting, you cut all your pieces before you make another adjustment. And then cut them all again, make an adjustment, cut them all again. That way you're not going back and forth making adjustments and trying to match up something that you cut previous. The other thing is, if you're working with a tenon and mortise where your pieces want to be flush when you're done, okay, then you want your tenon to be centered over your workpiece where the mortise is. You have to remember that every time you take a slice off of this side to get it to fit, you have to take a slice off of this side also. You can't take a slice off of one side only, because that's going to throw it off-centered and your piece isn't going to line up with your mortise. That is about it for the basic setup of the machine. We also have one other adjustment back here that I've never seen anyone use either. That's this one. And what it does is it tilts this stop back so that your tenon isn't the same all the way across. It comes off on an angle. And I don't know why you would do that, but I'm sure that there must be situations where you would do that. That's why they put it on the jig. This is the newer jig, the newest jig for tenon cutting. We had a couple of others, but they didn't seem to allow themselves the right latitude to get up close to the blade, so we ended up buying this jig here. Remember, there are other ways of cutting tenons. As we found out previously, you can cut nice tenons without the jig on the bandsaws. So Jim Bedient, when he went through his demonstration, showed us how to easily cut tenons on the bandsaw. But if you have multiple tenons and you want them all to be exactly the same, I would think that it would be worthwhile to set up the tenon jig. So we're ready to start. What we're going to do, we're not going to use any feather boards, of course, because this is basically a jig, like a sled. So the clamp and the track, the miter track, is holding everything in place. We're going to preset our saw a little bit. We're going to bring our blade up. Something like that. And then we're going to take the jig off, because what we want to do first, before you start cutting the cheek of the jig, is you want to cut your shoulder. You want to cut your shoulder on all your pieces all the way around. So we're going to take the jig off and cut our shoulder. I guess we could go to another saw, but I like to use this saw. Okay, now we're ready to cut our shoulder, and we're going to cut it all the way around the workpiece. Then we'll put the jig back on and actually cut the tenon out. When we cut the tenon, we're going to cut the two cheeks. The cheek is the wider side. We're going to cut those two, both sides, with the jig. Then we're going to take the piece over to the bandsaw and cut the edges to exactly the right width for our mortise. We're ready to go. Got my safety glasses on. Don't have any sleeves today. We're fine. Now you notice we have the shoulder cut. The shoulder is cut all the way around the tenon, and now we're going to go to the jig and cut down the width. You notice that we're using the fence as a measuring device, and we're using the miter gauge as the pusher. And the fence and the miter gauge are on opposite sides of the blade. Now, I know some of you are going to say, wait a minute, you always told us that if you're cross-cutting and your miter gauge is on one side of the blade and your fence is on the other side of the blade, you have to use the stop block to create that space in there. But keep in mind, we're not cutting clear through. So we're not going to have a piece laying in here between the blade and the fence. That's why we can get away with using the fence as a measuring device for our shoulder cuts, and we're not leaving anything between the blade and the fence to kick back. That's why we're doing it that way. Now we'll go back to the jig, get the fence out of the way, we won't be using it. And we'll clamp our piece in. I'm using one that I pre-cut previously, and you should always use sample pieces. Cut yourself a sample tenon, try it in your mortise. If it fits good, then use that sample piece for your setup, like we're going to do here. Now we're quite a ways away from the blade, so we're just going to tap this over a little bit, something like that. And we're going to make a cut, and then we're going to fine-tune it by shaving it off until it fits nice and snugly in the mortise. Okay, we're all set to go. We're locked in place. We're going to make a cut on both sides of the tenon. Oh, let me back up. What I have to do before I start is I have to adjust my height of the blade. And in order to do that, I've got to... This is what happens when you don't cut tenons every day. What we want to do is we want to bring your piece up here, something like that, and then raise the blade until the blade just gets into the kerf of the shoulder. Something about like that. And then we'll move it back over again where we were. Like that. Okay, now we're ready to cut. Remember, you got to cut both sides. Keep the tenon centered. Well, you can tell right away we don't have enough off of there. So let's move it over. We'll use our micro adjustment, and to do that we just have to unloosen the big knob there, and then we dial it over maybe another. You can always take more off, you just can't put any on if you take too much off. And remember, we're going to be taking off of both sides, so you want to be cautious when you start doing fine tuning. Well, we can tell right away we've got to take some more off. So we need to take off about 1/8 of an inch overall, which means we only want to set our blade so that we're taking off about 1/16. So we'll loosen this large one. with our micro adjustment, we'll take it over about 1/16 of an inch. Keep in mind now, if you had multiples, you would be passing them all through here for every one of these cuts before you changed your setting. We're getting down there pretty close, but we're just still a little tight. So we're just going to just a little bit, something like that. See what that does. Just a little tight yet. Remember, you can always take some off. Can't put it back on once it's off. So just take your time. Remember, you got a lot of time invested in this project anyhow with cutting the mortises. Now you're going to cut all the tenons, so this isn't the time to be in a hurry. Oh, that fits nice. Yes, that's perfect. Now we're going to cut down the width so that the width of the tenon will slip in there, and we're going to do that on the bandsaw. We're going to take about 1/8 of an inch off of each side. We'll use the fence, then we'll turn the bandsaw on, and we'll take it through the bandsaw until the bandsaw blade gets into the kerf right here, and then we'll back up. Again, we have to take it off both sides. We'll see how that fits. Yeah, that's it. See how nice and tight your fit is now. That's basically, you get the idea. You have to work with the scrap piece, and then take your scrap piece and use it for your setup. And then you can get in there and clean it out if you have to. But that's how your tenon should fit in your mortise. And that's basically all there is to the tenon jig. And usually we keep it right underneath this saw here. It's got some weight to it, so you want to come in when you're feeling frisky if you're going to use the tenon.